At dawn, the baker near the eastern gate started his ovens the same way he had every morning for years. Wood smoke caught in the still air above the narrow street. The dough was set to rise. The mountain to the north stood dark against the pale blue of the sky, and it was quiet. He had less than 16 hours to live. He did not know it. Nobody in the city did. It is the autumn of the year 79. The exact date is disputed. For centuries, historians placed the eruption on the 24th of August. But a charcoal inscription discovered in 2018 in a house on the northern edge of the city reads the 16th day before the 1st of November, placing the event in mid-October. That inscription is now the strongest evidence in the archaeological record. An October morning. A city of roughly 11,000 people going about their ordinary business beneath a mountain that had been quietly building toward this moment for months. If you had asked anyone in Pompeii about Vesuvius that morning, they would have told you it was a quiet mountain. They had lived beneath it their whole lives. The farmers on the lower slopes grew grapes and olives in soil so fertile from centuries of volcanic deposit that the land seemed abundantly blessed. The city below had theaters and bathhouses and a packed forum and a bakery near the eastern gate, with smoke already curling upward before the sun was fully over the ridge. They had no idea. The ground had been moving for days. A Roman writer named Pliny the Younger, who was 17 years old and staying at the naval base at Misenum with his uncle, 30 kilometers west across the bay, later recorded what they had noticed in the preceding days. Small tremors, nothing unusual for anyone living in the Campania region. 17 years earlier, in the year 62, a severe earthquake had damaged Pompeii badly enough that portions of the city were still under reconstruction in the year 79. People had grown accustomed to the shaking. They had built their city on the flank of a volcano and called it safe. But the mountain's behavior in the final weeks before October had been something different. The wells in several districts had run cloudy. The shoreline near the harbor had pulled back in places. The birds, one later account notes, had gone quiet near the mountain. None of these things, viewed individually, would have been enough to send anyone walking out through the city gates. But together, they were a warning that nobody had yet learned to read. Around 8 in the morning, the baker had his ovens at full heat. The forum was filling with merchants and buyers. You could smell fish sauce and fresh bread and the animal pens near the market stalls. The city was doing exactly what it had done on every ordinary morning that had come before. Everything was still in motion. The baker just did not know what it was all building toward. That was only round one. The clock was already ticking. The baker just could not hear it yet. Around 1 in the afternoon, the mountain opened. Then, at that hour, a column of gas, ash, and pulverized rock burst from the summit of Vesuvius and drove straight up into the sky. Pliny the Younger watched it from across the bay at Misenum. He later wrote 2 letters to the historian Tacitus describing everything he witnessed, and those 2 letters are the only surviving eyewitness account of what happened to Pompeii. He described a column that rose to an enormous height and then spread wide at the top, flattening and widening at altitude into the shape of the umbrella pine trees that lined the Roman roads. Volcanologists still call this type of eruption a Plinian column, after him. The column rose roughly 30 kilometers into the sky. That is not a typo, by the way. At the top of it, material was above the altitude where modern commercial aircraft fly. At the base, inside the crater, rock was being ejected at close to the speed of sound. Within minutes, Pompeii was in shadow. The baker came to the doorway of his shop when the column appeared. So did the people up and down the street. pumice began to fall on the city. Small, pale stones, each roughly the size of a walnut, lighter than stone has any right to be, warm to the touch. Strange, certainly. Odd enough to make people stop in the street and pick one up. But at that moment, nobody would have called it catastrophic. For a while, things actually seemed fine. Some people went back inside. Some stood in their doorways, watching the falling stones. The pumice accumulated slowly at first. Within an hour, there was a thin, pale layer across the cobblestones. Within 2 hours, it was at your ankles. By late afternoon, it was knee-deep. The weight on the rooftops of Pompeii grew heavier with every passing hour, and smaller, older buildings were already beginning to strain. While all of this was falling on Pompeii, something else was unfolding across the bay. Pliny the Elder, admiral of the Roman fleet at Misenum, and the uncle of the young writer who watched from shore, received word that people along the coast beneath the column were trapped and needed help. He ordered ships made ready and sailed directly toward the mountain. He stopped at Stabii, south of Pompeii, at the house of a friend. He ate. He tried to sleep while the building shook around him through the night. His companions urged him to return to the water. He stayed. The following morning, he died on the beach at Stabii, overcome by the gases that had thickened in the air. His nephew, however, survived at Misenum and wrote it all down. Every detail we have from an eyewitness present that day comes through those 2 letters. Back in the city. The night was dark and growing worse. By nightfall, pumice in the streets was waist-deep in some areas. Rooftops were collapsing across the city, the sound of heavy Roman tile and old timber giving way in the dark. You could hear it from inside any house still standing, but there was nowhere safer to go. Some people had left Pompeii hours earlier, walking out through the city gates with whatever they could carry. Some had gone to the harbor and found the sea too rough and churning to launch any boat. Others had moved into the large stone structures, the forum, the temples, the basilica, trusting that a building of sufficient mass would hold. Others remained in their homes, certain the mountain would stop before it reached them. The city could have emptied. It did not. Those who died in Pompeii did not, in the main, die in the first hours. They survived the darkness. They survived nearly 16 hours of pumice fall. But the pumice was not what killed them. What came down from the mountain in the final hours moved at the speed of a train and was hot enough to kill in a single breath. Across the bay, in the town of Herculaneum, the end arrived first. Herculaneum sat much closer to the mountain's flank, however, and the first pyroclastic surge, a dense, fast-moving current of superheated gas and fine volcanic material, reached it around midnight. 20th-century excavations found hundreds of people sheltering in the arched boat chambers along the waterfront, waiting for rescue ships. The surge found them there. Up to this point, Pompeii had been battered but not finished. That was about to flip. In the hours before dawn, the great column began to collapse under its own weight. A column of this scale, when it fails, does not simply fall. It cascades outward from the summit in fast-moving flows of superheated gas, ash, and rock. One after another, through the final pre-dawn hours, 6 of these surges rolled outward from Vesuvius. The first 3 did not reach Pompeii. They spent themselves on the nearer slopes. But the 6th surge, the largest, reached Pompeii in the gray hour before full dawn. It came over the northern wall. It moved through the streets the baker had walked every morning of his working life, past the forum, down toward the sea. Everyone still alive in Pompeii died within minutes, overcome by the heat and gases before the heavier material even arrived. Deep burial came later, from the ash that continued to fall for hours after the surges ended. but the people were already gone. And no, I am not making that up. The sequence of surges is documented in the stratigraphic layers that archaeologists have mapped across the site for more than a century and a half. When Giuseppe Fiorelli took charge of the Pompeii excavations in 1863, he noticed that the hardened ash contained hollow spaces where bodies had decayed inside the rock. He filled those hollows with liquid plaster. What came out were the people of Pompeii in their last positions: a man with his hands pressed to his face, a woman curled around a child, a dog still chained near the entrance of a house. The bakery near the eastern gate was still sealed when excavators reached it. The oven had been fired that final morning. Inside, 81 carbonized loaves remained on the baking trays where they had been set. The baker was found nearby. The ones who did not leave shared one belief: that the mountain would stop before it reached them. By the time they understood otherwise, Pompeii had already run out of mourning. If you want to be there the next time a city runs out of time, subscribe. Next time, we follow the final hours of another city that woke up ordinary and never saw the end coming. The door stays open.